All right, well, welcome y'all to today's little talk on this. I'm Gary Sitzer. I'm the DOF, the dull old farmer from Weiner, and she's the PhD with the real smarts.
Is this working?
Yeah,
No?
I think it is. Is it? There you go.
There.
All right. Anyway, let me just kind of set up a little bit what happened here. I farm right along Highway 214 by Old View there in Weiner, which is, yeah, there
So
you
this
go.
is exactly where we are in the state of Arkansas. So most of our experiment is going to occur, I'm not sure how this works. Oh, not that, not that.
There you go.
There. In Poinsett County, but I'll talk a little bit about some groundwater levels in Craighead and Mississippi County as well.
But anyway, they called and they were gonna replace the bridge, and long story short, they needed basically the sand from the top of the aquifer. And of course, I've farmed there all my life, so I told them, I said, we can go out there and you're gonna go down about 12 feet and you're gonna hit the top of the aquifer and it's gonna be a fine sand, most likely. And of course, they tested it, it was what they wanted. Anyway, we cut a deal, and basically I told them, you know, I'm more interested in what that looks like when you leave than I am in dollars. So we're going to fill it back in, and that's the kind of deal we cut. In the meantime, I talked to Dr. Leslie, Dr. Regan, some of them. I said, you've got this opportunity here. We've been talking about trying to do some kind of aquifer recharge analysis or project for a decade, I know. And I said, so we've got the possibility of doing that. So really want to commend them for getting together and putting something pretty thorough together in a pretty short period of time and pulling it off. So she can give you a little bit of the technical part of it, and we'll tell you what we learned.
We'll first just go a little through some intro. So this will just kind of give you a location if you're not from Arkansas in the audience. And then here's just a little bit of background about agriculture in Arkansas. So this main study is going to take place in Poinsett County. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is related mostly to Poinsett County. So agriculture is really a big livelihood in Arkansas, and Mr. Sitzer is one of the rice producers in Weiner, and he provided me with some of these images and this hashtag here, which Mr. Milo Hamilton talked a lot about today.
Yeah, some of our guys in Weiner thought that up when that was really popular. That is my farm. One of the farms I rent anyway, and that's me on the combine there, harvesting rice this past year. And the site's just about a mile and a half from there to the west.
So Arkansas ranks third in its amount of irrigated acres, and it produces 50% of the U.S. rice. And the traditional or conventional rice irrigation is through flooded paddies, and so their main irrigation source in much of the Mid-South is the Mississippi River Valley alluvial aquifer. So it's relatively shallow and very accessible to farmers in this area, but over time with increased acreage, we've seen an increase in the amount of groundwater used. And then, so specifically in our area that we'll be talking about, we have kind of an aquifer divide in Crowley's Ridge. So we see kind of different, which I'll show in a minute, different groundwater levels on the east and the west side of the ridge. And so, and I'll talk a little bit about our seasonal recharge, where we're seeing different recharges on the east compared to the west of the ridge. And this is mainly from aerial precipitation, and it's relatively small, and it depends on the annual precipitation amount. So this,
where the darkest reds are just about right where we are around Weiner. That's that's where we're having the worst. Right at the west side of Poinsett County. Historically, one of the older rice areas. Rice has been grown there just about as long as it has in Stuttgart, and so we've been using water for a long time. Of course, since the 70s, the acreage has increased substantially from what it was, plus irrigation of soybeans has increased dramatically. There's a little corn around, but it's primarily a rice soybean area, and most of that area is a 50-50 rice soybean rotation. That's just what seems to work well. In many cases, we couldn't grow any more rice if we wanted to because we don't have any more water than that. So, but that works well for both crops.
So you can see these depletions, so these declines in the alluvial aquifer, and these kind of coincide with the highest rice producing areas in Arkansas. And this kind of more southern area in the Grand Prairie region, there are constructions of water diversion plans of the White River and the Biomeda, and these will, relieve some of this groundwater use, and they'll use surface water. But in this Cache River area, where we have this other decline, we don't have any plans currently in the state for a surface water diversion. So in the area, oh, sorry, I forgot. So I just wanted to show y'all a little bit of recharge in the area and how it compares with the east and the west of the ridge. So in these next couple of graphs and a lot of the groundwater graphs, they're going to be groundwater altitude, so essentially the groundwater elevation, and then this will have a marking of the land surface elevation at the top of the graph. So the land surface elevation in this graph would be at 238 feet. And then on the right side will be the amount of precipitation that you see in these these vertical bars here.
Basically, if you're not familiar with Arkansas, Mississippi County is in the extreme northeast corner, right below the boot hill, and it's all west of the ridge and up against the Mississippi River. Makes its eastern border. So as you can see by that chart, they pull down during the pumping season, it comes right back. Pull down, comes right back. They get recharge off the river. Something we don't get on our side of the ridge.
And it also has a little bit to do with their infiltration rate from their soil type. So we're getting a little bit higher, faster infiltration, from sand. And even you can see this higher clay content. We're seeing this infiltration when you have larger amounts of precipitation. So here is some data in Craighead County, near Poinsett County, or right north above it. So here you can see a very large difference between the land surface elevation and the groundwater elevation. And so this would be just kind of south of Jonesboro a little bit. And again, you can see the importance of the annual precipitation, where we had this really increase in recharge because we had these higher precipitations at the end of 2015 through spring in 2016. And then we also have, and the USGS has a station in Wiener that has a website that shows the groundwater elevation in Wiener, and you can see it anytime you want. You can just go to the website and see what's kind of going on with the groundwater elevation. But just the main focus of this would be the recharge amount west of the ridge. So we're only really seeing 2 feet of recharge from the growing season into the spring recharge events.
Yeah. Bottom line is we're losing on average about a foot a year. That's what it all boils down to. So, it's not an inexhaustible resource in our part of the world.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that's the dots are some of the wells and pumps, and just some of the stuff that we've got going on in that area. And even on a small area, we're heavily saturated with irrigation in that area.
Right, so farmers kind of have adapted some other practices of this on-farm taking a piece of land out of production, creating a reservoir to store some of their spring and winter precipitation, and then to kind of create a gradient on their field so they can recover their water in the drainage ditches and pump it back into the reservoirs and then reuse it over time. So one of our postdocs has actually inventoried 700 of these systems in Arkansas. And then here is kind of a map of the ones in western Poinsett County. So this would be kind of Crowley's Ridge right here. And then these blue pieces of area are reservoirs.
Yeah, the blue ones are irrigation reservoirs, primarily purpose to get. The yellow ones are either dual use or wildlife type reservoirs that are in those areas.
Right. So the producers would have to take an area of land out of production, but this area of land you would have to have some kind of water source, or it makes it easier if there's a water source in the area as well. So we're trying to think about what are some ways that we can enhance groundwater recharge in this area besides this tailwater recovery kind of water conservation. So we're moving forward with this surface spreading, where we're going to use the aquifer to treat the water, surface water of contaminants. So these are kind of some options that we have where we can use this unsaturated aquifer to remove these contaminants in surface water. So you can see some options in these pictures where we have a spreading basin where the water would just infiltrate, kind of clean up the water, make it more kind of like enhance these biological processes naturally instead of just pumping in surface water directly into the groundwater. This bank infiltration is what they're doing in Mississippi along the Tallahatchie. So they'll use this connection between this higher infiltration rate of this sandy area, and they'll pump this groundwater out and then pump it into their groundwater decline area in Sunflower County. And then this is another kind of option of this infiltration gallery in which we would have injection wells that would be pumped into a perforated pipe, and that water could infiltrate through the unsaturated aquifer into the aquifer.
What most of us are familiar with, the cone of depression around all our pumps now, you think about reversing the process, you turn that would go kind of upside down. You'd hope to get that spread out. And, the reason you see the mud there in that example, that's what we've all thought, if we need to figure out if we're going to try to do any kind of aquifer recharge, because it'd be very easily for it to just silt over and seal off, and that'd be the end of it. Mm-hmm. And so how do you work that out? So, but first, we kind of want to do a proof of concept, and this opportunity came along. So that's where we are. Basically that red zone is impermeable clay. It's about 10 to 12 feet everywhere you go in that area, and then you get into the top of the aquifer with sand there.
So the highway department extracted all this sand, and then these were their initial soil core analyses information. So here, this is our monitoring well across from our experiment, the well log, which I've kind of depicted with its different lithology layers. And so you can see where the water table is currently, and presumed before irrigation started, that would be the water table would be at a depth of the water table of 15 feet. So we're looking, if we remove this confining unit, this clay layer, can we input surface water into the area and have this natural filter, to have this natural septic system to clean up the water and to this kind of enhanced groundwater recharge?
Yeah, for all practical purposes, back in my grandfather's day, they would excavate, down to that 15 to 20 foot area, and basically, for all practical purposes, put a relift in there and run it with a steam engine, and to pump water into canals and move it around the farm to grow rice. And that's basically the way the irrigation started. And it's always amazing how good they were back then with just transits and stuff, to how well they got those canals and things laid out. There wasn't such things as underground pipe back then, and it all worked out real well for them back then. But we're going to run out of water at some point. We don't come to some kind of a stabilization plan or go to a lot more surface water than we are at the present time.
Mm-hmm. So this is kind of our experiment setup. We have a weather station to measure elements of kind of the water balance table. So recharge, precipitation, and evaporation. This is our water source in the stream canal relift. And then we have a riser connected to a poly pipe that we pumped into the infiltration pit. And this is our groundwater monitoring well.
You can see the old rice levees there. It's a fairly steep field, and it's also very shallow topsoil. So it's not very conducive to doing a lot of landforming. You can't make any deep cuts in there. You get into that clay layer, which is extremely unproductive. And unless you've got a ton of money to move the dirt twice and bring the topsoil back in, or got a chicken operation across the road, that doesn't work. Basically, there's a watershed that feeds this. There you can see it's not a real big watershed, but it feeds down off there, and we've got this dammed up here here actually, and we catch that water, and it's been graded so that there's a relift up here going uphill, basically ties into underground pipe. It goes up here and ties to the well over there. So we already had the surface water source there, And so we picked that up and just tied on some poly pipe, ran it downhill, and put water in there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
And that's our space station.
So this is just our weather station. So we had really minimal evaporation, but we had this just kind of because it was a wintertime experiment. So but we did have a lot of precipitation. So this was a nice measurement, local measurement of the weather going on.
Yeah, there's the illustration of the pump, and it's actually pumping more than that looks like right there, but it wasn't pumping a whole lot of water, mainly because that's in the ditch area in the wintertime. A lot of the oak leaves and stuff all settle around that, and it's about half stopped up, I think. We didn't spend a whole lot of time trying to clean it back out just for this experiment, so it was 750 gallon a minute basically. That's what it was pumping.
So we pumped in about 1 million gallons of water into the pit. So these next,
Yeah, go ahead.
So these are I'll talk a little bit about the instrumentation that we put inside the pit. So we put 5 pressure transducers to measure the differences in the water level. So these 3 pressure transducers or the changes in the water level were connected to a data logger at the surface, and then pressure transducer 4 and number 5 are self-contained units. So they didn't need to be connected to a data logger. We also had staff gauges. So these, once we put the water level in the pit, I could tell the water level from these staff gauges, but because I couldn't pull these pressure transducers out until the end of the experiment. It just gave me a general idea of the water level in the pit. And these staff gauges also had game cameras on the surface taking pictures of them. And then we thought this was sand, but we wanted to do some soil analyses on soils within the pit valley floor. So we tested for organic matter, soil texture, and then we did a sieve analysis for sand composition. And then we used GPS and the level to figure out the surface area of the pit.
Obviously, if we'd been designing this for the experiment, we just had to use what we had there with the highway department, and they'd been tracking around in there with the track hoe, and they got near vertical banks, and all those things are not real conducive to not having a side bank erosion, and that track hoe running around there probably did a little extra compaction, even topped off for how much. No way to really know, but that's all factored in there to some extent. But that wasn't an ideal situation, but it was a situation we had, and like I said, they got a pretty good data set here to start with to at least do the proof of concept thing we've been talking about.
So these next couple of pictures are pictures of water pumping in the pit, and then I'll show the water level at these 2 staff gauges as we kind of go through time. So we started pumping at about 3:30 on February 5th, and then we pumped for 24 hours. So these next pictures, you'll just see the water level rise, and it rose really, we thought, faster than we thought. And so the highest water level was about around 9 feet here. So we turned the pump off just shortly after this photo.
I always tell the story, she loves the story. Anyway, the old routine about you might be a redneck. Well, I always say you might be an Arkansas rice farmer if you go home at the end of the day and you leave 2 PhDs sitting in lawn chairs drinking beer watching a hole fill up with water. Yeah, so that's what you get into.
I don't get to make a swimming pool every day, So I'll go through the next couple slides. We'll go through some water level data and the groundwater level altitude data. So this will be a graph of the water level depth. So the pressure transducer 1 the water level didn't get that high. Pressure transducer 2, it was only covered for about 2 days, so I'm not showing that data. Pressure transducer 3, it failed, so I didn't get any data from it. Pressure transducer 4, so this blue line was pulled out by the highway department because they were pulling out more sand. And then pressure transducer 5, it made it till the end, till I pulled out all of my instrumentation. There was still some water left in the pit by the time I pulled this pressure transducer 5 out, but not at the location where this pressure transducer was located. And then this is the staff gauge level 1. So you can see, so we input, this is our water input here, our pumping experiment, and then you only see water level rises after precipitation events. And we had about in total across this experiment about 24 inches of rain that occurred. And they were relatively really big events here, about 4 inches here and then about 9 inches that occurred at the end of March. So you can see this subsequent, this rise and then this fall in the pit. So we are seeing infiltration within the pit in these sand layers.
It's kind of like farming. It's good to have options and redundancy, because if they just put one out there, they wouldn't have got much data. They'd have picked the wrong one.
So these are our soil data. So not much organic matter. So these samples were collected along the pit wall. And then most of the samples that were collected were the highest percentage of soil was sand. And they range from like loamy sand, sandy loam to sand. And then some had the sandy clay loam. And the highest percentages within the sand were medium to fine grained sand. So again, this is a groundwater elevation graph. So this is the land surface elevation, and this is the groundwater elevation with precipitation on this right axis. So I didn't do a tracer, so I can't, and I don't have any monitoring within around the pit, so I can't exactly say that our input into the pit raised the groundwater level, but you can see these spikes after precipitation events, but I don't have any scientific evidence to really say that the pit water raised the groundwater
How
table.
far was that well? Did you measure? It was
Yeah, I
1,000,
mean,
about 1,000
it's like
feet?
0.3 meters away, so it's not, I mean, it's across the road, but.
Yeah, I mean, it was like 1,000 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that, the water went somewhere. Obviously, it went in the ground, but it probably didn't laterally move in the aquifer enough to probably ever be picked up that 1,000 feet away on this limited experiment on the deal. But it also, you got to think, and we don't know either how the depth that it infiltrated. We were guessing maybe that if we ever matched, and if you do the math, it's about 110 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we ever got water down 110 feet and touched the aquifer, would the infiltration rate then accelerate rather than, in a vertical column rather than trying to just continue to spread out horizontally. So that's just, some more of the stuff you really don't know for sure, but you can kind of guess, kind of makes common sense. So, and the infiltration rate, may just kind of basic physics too. The deeper the water, the more pressure you got pushing down, so it's probably going to infiltrate a little faster than it is when it's shallower. So, that's just kind of where it is. If you were doing it on an ongoing basis, in the wintertime, you probably want to keep it pretty full as much as you could, because once you get to the pumping season, you wouldn't have any water to put in it. So you'd want it full as many days as you could, probably.
It was nice to do this experiment during the winter season because we didn't see any kind of growth of organic matter until the temperatures warmed up. And so that's a concern with these infiltration pits, because we will form that organic layer on the bottom of the pit, and that will it's slow infiltration. So this was a calculation of infiltration that I did using water level measurements from pressure transducer 5, along with the evaporation rate and precipitation. So you see the highest it got obviously was at the beginning. We had this much higher hydrologic gradient because the more water level, the greater depth of the water table. And so through this infiltration rate, we calculated about a 7-foot acre foot groundwater increase. So about 7 football fields of water that was infiltrated into the groundwater system through this infiltration rate. And so these are our conclusions that we have from this work. So a simple infiltration pit could probably enhance aquifer recharge in our area. Their work probably is concerned with erosion. So if you saw on this last kind of slide, there were a lot of caving in around these sides and lots of unstabilized kind of sand and areas in here. So we didn't really measure this, so there could have been some fluctuations of input into the pit due to this. Oops. If we could do this again, I'd like to put some more monitoring in the unsaturated zone around the pit or around a pit. But this, I feel like this experiment does tell us that this unsaturated aquifer zone is a valuable natural filter and somewhere we can store this water underground that it won't evaporate. So we are kind of moving things, hopefully moving things forward. The USGS has a big project to map out the availability of the aquifer. So hopefully they're going to come to Arkansas and kind of refine the thickness of the confining unit and locations where it's thinner and absent. I'm moving forward looking at source water quality in on-farm storage reservoirs. And then, well, once these kind of things happen, can we find this thin confining unit area that coincides with the water source and not being used for agriculture?
Just from a farmer practical standpoint, what I was looking at is, I farm and rent several farms that have reservoirs on them now, some as big as 80 acres. And, if you've got landowners that are willing to take that much ground out of production, in some cases they don't have much choice. But if you're a smaller landowner, it's hard to tell them, you've got to take 10 or 15% of your ground out of production when they don't start with very many. To start with, it'd be easier to me to sell that to a landlord, say we're going to take an acre or two or three or whatever to build, this kind of an infiltration unit, and maybe, at the very least we begin to stabilize the aquifer there before it's completely depleted. So that's a selling point. As far as filtration and stuff, if we've got a surface storage area now, it's got some natural cleanliness to it, and they've got a pretty good database from some of the other reservoirs on water quality during the year, but particularly the wintertime when we have surplus water, like the biologics are pretty much shut down, so that's an advantage. And if you maybe have to come up with a better plan to actually maybe force it in there, with who knows, maybe solar powered pumps or whatever to run in the wintertime to actually pressurize it a little bit on some gradients in there at a different way. But in the end, in our area, you're looking at all this dry sand and fine and gravel under the ground, how do they filter most water? They run it through a sand filter. So in a lot of ways, if we by perchance had some contaminants in there that it's highly likely we've got the greatest filter in the world there to take it out before it ever got to the aquifer there completely anyway. So we've got a resource there that we could maybe recharge that would help out a lot, especially in smaller areas and maybe on some of the larger areas too. But for a quick put together proof of concept thing, they did really well. I really want to compliment them for it.
So I'd just like to acknowledge and thank some people. So a lot of this work, most of this work was funded through Cotton Incorporated, a core grant. I would like to thank the Arkansas Highway Department. Hopefully I wasn't in their way too much. And then also a lot of these people from my research group helped me in this project. I couldn't have done it without them. So, and then currently this is the pit now.
Well, as I said, I negotiated in there to make it look back like it was when they started, because I didn't really want the liability, and it wasn't really big enough for a reservoir or anything else, and it was at the bottom of the field. It just didn't have any. It was right by the highway. I just didn't want the liability, somebody driving off in it or anything else, and making that happen. So as far as that goes, we've been trying to think of a name for the thing, and I think Dr. Reed would thought of the pit of opportunity, but the acronym was terrible, so I kind of came up with the aquifer recharge experiment because everybody that drove by said, "Gary, what are you doing?" And so that and the weather station too. It was quite the topic of conversation there for a while. Pumping water in the middle of the winter time and pumping it in a hole, and all these people running around out there all the time. So. I don't think the highway department cared too much. The contractor may have been a little anything that didn't go exactly his way probably was a little contentious at times. But anyway, we got it done, or they got it done. I watched a lot. So anyway, does anybody got any questions or kind of know what we're up to?
Sure.
So is this method being used in other places in the world to recharge
Mhm.
depleted aquifers?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have a big project in Arizona where they have these basins. I mean, there's a fine line of the depth of the infiltration basin where you're actually where you're getting increased and not have organic growth. But yes, it is a common thing.
And I want to say back, and I think it was all the way back to the Huckabee administration, that some Israeli researchers came over here and said, well, we do that all the time in Israel. That y'all are nuts. It rains here. Why aren't you doing it? You know. So, but I've never really been able to find it, if there's much documentation. It was all working off memories, probably somewhere in some archive, but I don't know if they ever posted it anywhere or not. But yes, sir.
These saltwater injection wells that they have out west, how deep are they compared to what y'all are doing here?
You know, you talking about like for the oil industry and that kind of stuff. It just depends on where the oil is. Most of the time, the oil is pretty deep. You know, in most cases,
Right.
a lot more
So the
than
problem that we're facing is that the aquifer is a drinking water source. Like most of those oil aquifers are really, really deep, and you could probably inject, you know, relatively clean, you know, rehabilitated drinking water into that aquifer to replenish the aquifer there. But we can't. We would have to bring the water to drinking level standards in our area, and so that's really expensive and way out of and the funding and I would need a lot of people.
Yeah, well, that was the concern. You know, I just didn't want to do it and go out there and you know, guesstimate. You know, I thought, you know, if we're going to do it, we needed some real data, and we needed to do it right so that, you know, we didn't have any problems. And you know, they did, you know, water analysis, pretty thorough stuff on the source coming out of the reservoir. So, you know, it's you know, was pretty clean, you know, situation. Very, very, very small residues of anything in that time of year. So we're pretty fortunate on that. And those of you that mess with reservoirs know that, you know, you got a better quality water than in my part of the world than you do from underground sources. You know, you're not pumping the salts and all that, and you can actually, in fact, that field that was up there, that the polypipe went across, that was one of my higher pH fields years ago. And even though it's a fairly small reservoir, and you know, we pretty much stabilized the pH, and it actually came down a little bit just by going to even the not 100% surface water.
Has anyone looked into the possibility of pumping that water from the east side of Crowley's Ridge over to the west side? It's not the same.
Yeah, I mean, that's.
I just don't think that the state wants to invest that kind of money because of the prolonged, the current surface water diversion plants, because they've been in the planning stage since the 90s, and all the kind of ecological things that people don't really know what's going to happen.
A lot of issues with the St. Francis Basin.
Well, back in it probably was the 90s. I know the Corps came to Wiener and they had a big meeting and basically was trying to replicate a little bit of what they're doing on the Grand Prairie, thinking about going up on the Black River, way up, and then diverting it down existing streams. And a lot of their baseline assumptions, even then, I didn't agree with and still don't. You know, they went under the theory that 10% of all the irrigated ground in that part of the world is going to be put in reservoirs. And that's the maximum. Nobody's ever going to put more than 10%. Well, I've got one farm that has more than 10%, but there's, on average, that might be right. But, you know, they thought once you hit that point, there would not be enough precipitation in the winter to fill them all. Mm-hmm. And that's hard for me to believe that math comes out right. You know, of course, as long as I've been there, you know, of course, this may be the year I don't get them full of this year, you know, if we have a dry spring. But, you know, those kind of assumptions, and no one wanted because they're not going to divert the Black River in July. They're going to divert the Black River, according to their theory, in January and February, which a lot of times I'm worried about having too much water. So it was kind of that was their baseline, and it's about as far as I ever heard it going. So the odds of them ever diverting any water in there is probably pretty small, you know. So they've been working on how many decades at Grand Prairie and hadn't got the first gallon out of the White River yet, I guess, going down through there. So. Well, like I said, I cut that deal with them. He tried to buy me off at the end and leave the hole there, and I held to my original plan. They hired two ag double dirt pan rigs, and they actually bought it from a neighbor, and hauled it over there, and they took their dozers and stuff and pushed it in and leveled it. And I was farming during that time. I can't tell you the exact number of days, but it took them probably over a week to haul it in there. Of course, they depend on the weather and everything else. If it rained during that time, but it took them, several yards, so it took them quite a while to do it, so.
Oh, yeah.
I live just north of where the east and west Cache Rivers come together and go south. And, we're always hearing about the flooding problem from the Cache River, especially south of where I live. Geographically, is there any way to capture that water? Because it seems like there's a tremendous amount of water below 230 highway.
Yeah, and it's the same story that a lot of those areas, like by Old View, when it's at flood stage and about to run over that one farm I've got, or the landlord's got levied off, when it's right at the top of those levees, I probably don't need any in my reservoirs. They're probably already full, a lot of times. And so getting it there when you need it's a big part of it. And the cache, just line of sight, is several miles. So, I mean, it's not impossible. But, farmer, I'd like for them to, be like out west, June, July, and August, we're going to send you so many acre feet of water. Here it comes, get it, but that's when the cache is probably dry, And if it's not dry, it's probably been raining. If it's been raining, you don't need the water. So that's, unfortunately, there's not any real good solutions there other than transferring it, during times of surplus. Okay, yes.
You said on the east side of the river, on the east side of the ridge, they don't have the aquifer going down and all that staying replenished. Is that because of its proximity to the river?
It's
Big-
been
go ahead.
hypothesized to that, and the soil type, that there's a little bit more, there's sand.
Yeah, they don't have the hard pan layer on a lot of those acres, and so they get vertical infiltration and a lot of recharge from the Mississippi and the floodway system that runs down out of the boot hill down through there. There's infiltration on that, and so they're just blessed with a totally different situation than what we've got, and their gallons withdrawal is often with their soil type. When I first started thinking about it, I thought, boy, they're really blessed over there. They're picking water up from 15, 20, 30 feet, and I'm picking it up from 100 plus feet. But my soil type holds water so well from a rice farmer's perspective, my gallons may not be any greater than theirs, because they may have to pump more gallons from a shallower depth than I will pump fewer gallons from a deeper depth because I hold it so well. But I always tell people, until I went to college, I thought a soybean root went down 2 inches and turned 90 degrees. I didn't know there was anything else, because that we've got that hard pan that's 12 feet thick, and that's just where things are. So we get nothing, virtually, that recharges from above, or very, very little.
How much zero grade do you have in that area? I know it has to be some.
There's very little real zero. I've got a 220 acre field that's on 04 slope, so it's not zero, but it's pretty darn flat. And that was just almost, it didn't take like 100 yards an acre to get it to that. So it was pretty flat to start with. So, most of the ground is there's a lot that's been graded, a lot still not been graded because it's so shallow, as far as cuts and fields, that there's, and a lot of landlords have just been reluctant. You're making good crops on it the way it is, why should I spend any money on it, but basically there's not a logic. And part of the thing too is, if you're already flat and you go to zero grade, then the bottom of your perimeter ditch doesn't have anywhere to go because it's at the same level as everything else. It always appeared to me the zero grade worked where that perimeter ditch had enough drop off, so it had fluid pressure to drain when you did need it to drain. And if you could stair step that worked great. But
Well, I didn't know. I mean, the reservoirs. I'm on that side of the ridge, we're blessed with water, but I'm also at the bottom of the pool. Sometimes we don't have anywhere to run our water to.
yeah, too. So you need the opposite problem. You need a way to get rid of it.
Yeah, we need to pump the water to you. But,
Yeah.
it seems to me that the expense of the reservoirs and the continuous piping and things like that, with the zero grade situation, not alleviate some of your water pressure. with that zero grade, it looks like the infiltration would take place better. I realize the hard pans.
Yeah.
But if you were holding steady, I mean, we're able to manage water so much easier with one outlet out of the field rather
Yeah.
than all those levees, and it's just like a continuous pumping process.
Yeah. I can't answer your question, just based on personal experience. I'd say I don't think it's gonna change a whole lot, just because of the infiltration, but no matter how we did it. Because a lot of these systems, I mean, unless we just boo-boo, there's never any water runs out the bottom of the field. And if they do, it goes into a tailwater ditch, and we put it back in the reservoir. You know, now, if we gets the weather and we've got a pretty good flood on rice and it rains 4 inches, we're gonna have runoff. You know, they know that way around it. But generally speaking, you know, everything you can do to save water has an advantage. You know, of course, now with the OptiSurface or different names they use, you know, a lot of them are going to that to just basically for the other crops so they can row water that. So right now that's in our area is keeping from making very many deep cuts. Because, you know, whenever I look at a cut sheet, first thing I look at is how deep's the deepest cut and how big an area is it. You know, and then I start trying to minimize that any way I can, you know, because I won't live long enough to see. I always give the example when I was in high school, we had a little corner and it was hard to water because it was high, and I told Dad, so let's go out there with our little toy dirt pan, cut that off and see. I said, we're not raising nothing there now because we can't water it. And he said, okay, let's just experiment. And it probably wasn't as big as this room. And that was 40 years ago, and there's nothing growing on that spot. We put it in CRP and the pine trees died. So, so you get into a sodium layer at one point, there ain't nothing growing. So.
I guess I'm blessed with gumbo. I fuss and whine about it sometimes, but
Well, you have some native fertility. I said, we have to make our own fertility. She talked about the organic matter on that side deal. She could have went out in the field. It wouldn't have been a whole lot different, you know. I had a researcher one time before he got on the bus told me, as far as soybeans, and it was on the field right there, that he said, every day from the time you open the soybean seed sack to your combine leaves the field, your soybean is in stress in this kind of soil. It's too wet or too dry every day. It's never just dry. So. All right.
Thank y'all.
Appreciate y'all. Thanks.